So we're going to continue with chapter 1 of Tanya, and we're going to start from where we left off. Just a quick synopsis of what we learned. We learned, and we started the beginning of Tanya by understanding that the Alter Rebbe is after a particular goal here. And the goal here for him is to teach us about a category of people that are called a Beinuni. And from what we have learned so far in the beginning of Tanya, is that this unique group of people are not tzaddikim, they're not righteous people, because we learned the definition of righteous, and that's a very lofty level. A tzaddik, a righteous, is someone who has never committed any sin. And we obviously have learned about the wicked people. It's very simple. Wicked people are doing bad things, either some of the time or all the time. So that's them, different categories of wicked people. And we still haven't fully understood what a Beinuni is. But what we tried doing, we kept on coming up with explanations as to what it may be, and those answers kept on getting eliminated. You know, we thought maybe a Beinuni is somebody that does sometimes commit sins. And then we saw sources in the Talmud that says, no, that's not the case. At that point, when somebody does commit a sin, that person is considered to be a wicked person. And if later did teshuvah or repented, becomes a righteous person. So no matter what scenario we kept on thinking about, somehow it doesn't fit the Beinuni. And however, what we did understand is that Beinuni is a very lofty level, whatever it is, which we're going to try to find out soon. And we had an example of that because Rabbah, who was one of the most famous sages and leaders of his generation, going back to about 2,000 years ago, thought that he was a Beinuni. So it must have been that a Beinuni is a very lofty level if a person like him could consider himself in that level. And yet we don't know what this Beinuni is. And what was that lofty level, by the way? If you recall, Rabbah was the one that was on such a high level where he was constantly busy learning Torah, so much so that his soul couldn't even be taken away from him. And yet he, what we're going to find out later, mistakenly, he mistook himself to be considered a Beinuni. So now, in order to explain all of those questions that we kept on coming up with, and our curiosity about what a Beinuni is going to start getting unfolded tonight, where we're going to get to the bottom of the essence of the soul of a person and what makes a person tick. And to launch into that, the Alter Rebbe in Tanya starts off by bringing and explaining something from the writing of Kabbalah of mysticism, which was written by Reb Chaim Vital. Reb Chaim Vital himself was a very famous Kabbalist, and he lived many years. Towards the end of his years, as he was an elderly person, he actually became the student of one of the youngest Kabbalists that ever lived, whose name was the Arizal. Arizal, whose teachings of Kabbalah and his school of explaining Kabbalah has become de facto the foundation for all learning and teachings of Kabbalah. And many of the prayer books are based on his teachings, including all Sephardic prayer books and some Ashkenazic prayer books are all organized, and they have been, the way it's set up is all according to the teachings of the Arizal, the Kabbalistic teachings that he gave us. He himself never wrote anything down. He always taught. However, his foremost student, which was Rab Chaim Vital, is the one that committed everything that he learned from his Rebbe, from the Kabbalist. He committed it to writing. So, in the writings of Rab Chaim Vital, he touches upon this subject of the soul of a person, and this is what he writes. So the Alter Rebbe continues on page 10 of the PDF that I posted and I gave out. Ach Beur Ha'inyan, the explanation of everything that we have said so far and all the questions that we have unfolded so far can be found in what Rab Chaim Vital has written, Rab Chaim Vital of blessed memory, B'Sha'ar HaKedusha, in the gate of holiness, Ube'etz Chaim, and also in his other writing, the book that is called The Tree of Life, gate number 50, chapter number 2. The Lechol Ish Yisrael, and this is what he writes over there, that every single Jewish person, Echad Tzadik ve'Echad Rasha, whether the person is a tzaddik, a righteous person, or whether this person is the other extreme, a person that unfortunately has fallen through and keeps on falling through, and therefore is considered to be a rasha, a wicked person. Yesh shtei neshamas, this person, all of them, every single person has actually two souls that give it life. Uchedichsiv neshamos ani asisi, and as it has been written in the verses where God says, and souls I have created. When God is referring to a single person, God says, I have created souls. Why souls in plural? Because it's referring to the fact exactly what we're about to learn, that every single person has two souls. So one of them, the first one, is from this soul comes from the level of Sitra Achra, from the other side, and from Klippa, level of impurity. Those are Kabbalistic terms referring to anything that is the opposite of holiness. In writings of Kabbalah, whenever it wants to talk about levels of impurity and unholiness, it uses these two terminologies. Either in Hebrew, it calls it klipa, which means shell, or it will use the Aramaic words sitra achra, the other side. What do those words mean? How do they refer to impurity? So klipa, which is in Hebrew, refers to a shell or a skin or covering. Why? Because, for example, when you want to eat pistachios, you have what you want to eat, which is inside of it, but there's shells that is covering it. So the shells really have no use. So you just toss them out. Or the other terminology, sitra achra, the other side, as it's translated, it's the other side of what? The other side of holiness. In other words, the side of holiness, anything that is close to godliness is exactly that, close. However, something that is further away from holiness and godliness is like on the other side of the line, right? So if you were to draw a line, so to say, if there is a border separating between good and bad, between holiness and impurity, so holiness is closer to godliness. The other side, as is the Aramaic terminology, means the opposite side, the one that is further away from godliness. So whenever we're going to be using, sometimes I'm just going to use the English words, impurity, unholiness, and sometimes I may mention the Hebrew or Aramaic word for those, which may be klipa or sitra achra. So here, what Rab Chaim Vital in the writings of mysticism is explaining is that the first soul that we're being introduced to at this point is a soul that has its roots from the side of impurity. It actually stems from the realm of impurity. And this soul, which is in a person, actually has some interesting function. This is the soul, vehi hamislabeshes bedam ha'adam. This is the soul that encloses itself in the blood of a person, lahachayus haguf, to give life to the body. Uchedichsev, and as it says in the verse, ki nefesh habasar badamhi. When God is giving us the commandments, and he gives us the commandment not to eat blood from any animal, right? In Judaism, we're not allowed to consume any blood from the animal. We not only we cannot drink it, but we have to make sure that even after an animal is slaughtered, before we eat it and before we cook it, that is completely drained of any blood, which is the reason why we have the process of salting, right? We're supposed to put salt on the meat so that it soaks all the blood that is in the meat, and then we rinse it off because we are forbidden from having any blood. So in that verse, when God says that, hey, you're not allowed to have any of the blood that is in a living thing, God finishes that sentence by saying, because the soul, the life of the flesh is in the blood, which is explaining to you the function of the animalistic soul, the soul that gives life. And this first soul, which comes from the side of impurity, is labeled in mystical writings as the animalistic soul. Why is it called the animalistic soul? Very soon, we're going to be explained by the Alter Rebbe that not because it's an animal. Obviously, it's a soul, and a soul is from God. God is the one that has created this soul, even though we're saying that it comes from the side of impurity. So when we say that it comes from the side of impurity, we're not talking about a source that is separate from God or against God. It's still, this soul is created by God. However, the way this soul receives life force, spiritual life force, is not that close to God. So therefore, we say that it's further away and it cannot feel godliness. It has fallen further away from the way God intended for purity to be. And this is where the first soul of the person takes root from. And in the next chapter, we're going to be introduced to the second soul of a person, which is what is called a godly soul. Again, both souls come from God, but their characteristics are different. And it's all going to be explained by the Alter Rebbe. Umimeno bos. So this soul, this first soul that we're talking about, that we are calling the animalistic soul, is a soul that is in the body and is in charge of giving life to the body. And from this very soul is where all the bad traits and characteristics of a person come. And where do they come from exactly? So the bad characteristics of a person comes from the four spiritual elements that are in this soul. What are those spiritual elements? The spiritual elements are like this, and the bad characteristics that come from it. Dahainu, ka'as v'gaiva, in a person that has anger and always boasting. So these kind of characteristics come miyesud ha'esh, from the spiritual element of fire, which is in the soul. Why? Shenagva lemarla, because just like the physical character of a physical fire is that the flame constantly wants to rise up and goes up, no matter which way you turn the fire, the candle, the flame will always be going up straight. So too, in a person, the characteristic that might manifest itself is somebody who is boastful or somebody who's getting angry. Why is somebody who's getting angry? We say that it's just like fire because the reason why a person gets insulted and takes things personally and gets angry is because they feel that they have been wronged, right? A person feels that I should have been respected more, that why did the other person do this to me? And I deserve much more than this. So all of this because a person holds himself or herself on a very high level, therefore a person gets insulted. Therefore a person gets angry. How dare he do this to me? So just like a fire that is always picking itself up above everything else, wants to constantly go high, so too is the characteristic that comes from that element. Another bad characteristic that could come from this soul, animalistic soul, is taivas hatanugim, the the pleasure of of everything in the world that gives a pleasure. Miyasod hamayim. In other words, the fact that a person might indulge in anything and everything that gives pleasure, including forbidden pleasures. So this comes from the element of water in this soul. Because water gives growth to all sorts of pleasure. And talking emptiness and acting like a joker without any seriousness at all, vehispirus, and to constantly think that, yeah, look at me, I'm better than everybody else, with devarim betalim, and somebody who just talks without anything substantial in the talk, just likes to talk, and it's all empty conversation without any goal, without anything. So all of that comes miyasod haruach, from the element of wind. So far we learned about fire, water, wind, and it's going to tell us that the fourth one is earth, like dust. And what are the type of characteristics that come from that? The atzlus miyasod offer, laziness and sadness, depression, come from the element of dust. And this soul that we're talking about, the first soul, the animalistic soul, has all of these elements in it. So there are times when people may experience just being lazy and or just having a depression for no reason whatsoever. And it's all taking root coming from this soul. So this soul so far we have understood, which is the first soul that we're being introduced to, the animalistic soul, has some bad elements. But now what the Alter Rebbe is going to tell us, that this soul could also have some goodness in it too. It's not pure bad, but it has goodness in it too. Also, the good nature that is in many people, in Jewish people, as they're born, kemo rachmanus, like let's say having pity on somebody else, having compassion, or gemilus chasadim, and doing acts of kindness towards others. Boas mimena also come from this soul. So this soul has the potential of good as well. Because this soul that we're talking about in every single one of us is a soul that is of a particular kind. In the writings of mysticism, it explains that when we're talking about levels of impurity that exist in the world, there is two general categories of levels of impurity. There's levels of impurity in the world that are completely not good. They're completely evil, and there's no benefit from them. And then there is levels of impurity which have the potential of something good coming from them. And it all depends on how you interact with it. A typical example of that would be, so let's say, let's take category of food and animals, okay? So you could have an animal like a pig, right? So a pig is rendered not kosher, right? The Torah tells us we're not allowed to eat pig. We're not allowed to eat ham. Why? As we're going to learn soon in a couple of chapters further, it's going to explain in detail how it's incompatible with our soul and our body. But meanwhile, I just want to concentrate on the food itself. So a pig is the level of total impurity. In other words, if you take a pig and take it to a very holy rabbi, and you tell the rabbi, please, I want you to slaughter this with your slaughter knife and say 50 blessings over it, rabbi. I want to make sure this is like really holy. And he does it. And you take the food and you cook it. And then you bring it out on Shabbat or whatever it may be. No matter what you're going to do, this food will remain prohibited, and God doesn't allow us to eat it. There's nothing good that could come out of this food. But let's say another type of food, and that would be, let's say, the cow as an example. The cow has the potential of good in it. Yeah, you can't just eat it like that. But if you take a cow, because it has the potential of something good coming out of it, and you slaughter it properly, then you cook it the kosher way, and you eat it the right way, and so on and so forth. Now, this food is possible to be used. So here's the difference between these two. Pig is considered to be something that is totally impure, and nothing good could come out of it. And cow is something that goodness could come out of it, depending on how you work with it. Another example of these two extremes would be, for example, some matters of science. There may be some discovery in science, for example, nuclear medicine, right? Or nuclear science. Is nuclear power something that is totally evil, or is it something that has the potential of good? Well, originally, I think people thought that it's totally evil. All it could do is destruction. But obviously, now we know that the same power could be harnessed if it's done properly, and good could come out of it. It could provide energy to who knows how many millions and millions of households if it's used in a controlled and proper way. So throughout the world, there is many things that are either totally impure or they have the potential of pure. In Kabbalistic terms, the type of impurity that has potential of good is called klipat noga, the shiny shell. Why is it called the shiny shell? Because just like the example that I gave you before, the shell of pistachios or the peel of an orange or the peel of a banana, if you remove the shell, if you remove the peel of that fruit, something good is at the middle. Now you have revealed something that has an actual usage, that has some potential of good. So the level of impurity in the world that is called the shiny shell or klipat noga in Hebrew is referring to anything and everything that is mixed with bad, but if you work with it properly, you would be able to bring forth the good and bring out the good from that thing, whatever it may be. The other level of impurity, Kabbalah explains, is the level that is called Shalosh Klippos Hatmeis, the threesome levels of impurity, the triple level of impurity. Those are anything and everything in this world that have absolutely no goodness ever coming out of them, no matter what you're going to do with it. So these two terminologies are important to learn and to remember, because throughout learning Kabbalah and mysticism, these terminologies will come to use many, many times. Going back to our subject matter, so this soul that we have so far spoken about, the first soul that we were introduced to in a person, we did say that it comes from the level of klippa, from the level of impurity. However, it comes from the level of impurity that is called the shiny shell, which means it has the potential of good if you work with it properly. The soul that we're talking about is not pure bad, is not pure evil. It has tendencies that are not necessarily in line with godliness and spirituality. But if it's controlled, if it's tamed, and if it's worked with, it actually has the potential also to have a lot of good things come out of it. And now you will understand why this soul in Kabbalistic terminology is called the animalistic soul. Because not that it's an animal, but just like an animal has tendencies that just serve itself, animals are very self-centered. They don't think about what's good for the world and what's good for the economy and what's good for the future. Animals are very simple. I want to eat. I'm hungry. I want to eat now. I want to procreate now. Finish. And that's all that matters. And once they eat, finish. Nothing. When the lion finishes eating, it's not going to bother you. The stomach is full. It's a very self-centered and just cater to themselves. That's what animals are all about. It's all about themselves. And so the nature of this soul, the first soul that we're talking about in a person, the nature of this soul is that it just wants everything that is good for this person, for the physical body, for the pleasures, for the satisfaction, for what makes me happy, even if it's just temporarily, which are characteristics of animals, that all they care about is themselves. So therefore, this soul is named the animalistic soul. And that's exactly what we just learned. And the book of Tanya explained that a person's want for pleasures of the world, just for the sake of the pleasure, it's coming from that soul. Now, is that bad? Is this an absolutely impure and evil soul? No, not so. It has natural tendencies to just physical matters and anything that gives pleasure to a person. But it's still a soul, but it's just not refined. It's not so in touch with godliness. But it has a potential of good as well. And that's why the Tanya is explaining that this soul actually has a very lofty source. This soul comes from the level of what is called Eitz Hadas Tov Bara, the tree of knowledge, good and bad. In other words, going back to the story of Genesis, Adam and Eve were told not to eat from the tree of knowledge, right? God told them, don't eat from the tree. And they did. So what happened? What happened was, obviously, they committed a sin. But at the same time, what they experienced as a result was a mixed bag. from one side, Adam and Eve, and thereby the entire humanity, gained a level of awareness and wisdom that they didn't have before. On the other hand, it's exactly what God didn't want them to do. What was the what was it that they gained by eating from the tree of knowledge? Before eating from the tree of knowledge, Adam and Eve were only aware of spiritual depth and meaning in everything in the world. Everything they saw was a manifestation of God. And that's the way they perceived it. That's the way they understood it. And everything made perfect sense. When they experienced the world, it wasn't like, oh, we're going to have pleasure. No, it was we're living the life of God. After they ate from the tree of knowledge, suddenly what got infused in them and released into them by virtue of partaking from that tree was that they started relating to the world, not just from the spiritual perspective, but from a lower perspective as well, which was suddenly they started feeling and understanding the pleasures of life. So they were no longer looking at everything and going about life just because God has said so. They started having their own personal feelings and pleasure out of those things. And one of the examples that the Torah gives is, if you recall the stories, after they ate from the tree of knowledge, what was the first thing they did? Suddenly they were hiding. They were embarrassed. Why? Because they realized they're naked. So 1 second, the story, it gets very interesting. What do you mean? Until then, they didn't know they were naked? Of course they knew they were naked. They had no clothing. Suddenly they eat from the tree of knowledge, and now it's bothering them that they're naked. What changed? What changed was that up until then, what they saw in the world, everything was for the sake of spirituality. Even when they saw their bodies, so what did they see? They saw a body and the parts of the body that can be used for a holy purpose to procreate, to bring other souls down to this world. And to them, that was a very godly thing and lofty thing. However, once they ate from the tree of knowledge, suddenly it wasn't just a spiritual and godly thing. Once they saw their body, they realized, wow, this could also be used for just pleasure. And suddenly they realized, you know what, our eyes have now opened up, and they were embarrassed because they felt they have fallen from that lofty and spiritual level that they had before. Now they felt they have to cover themselves because now they see something bad about their body, something that they could be ashamed of. So that was the effect of the tree of knowledge. Yes, it brought knowledge to them, which you could say was good, but at the same time it was bad because it suddenly opened up their eyes into a whole different dimension in the world, which was far from spirituality. It was all selfish, self-pleasure, and anything and everything else that is just very physical. So this soul, the first soul that is in a person, takes its root from the tree of knowledge. So it's a mixed bag. Yes, it's a soul. At the same time, it has some potential of good, but it also is the source of many bad characteristic traits in people. So this is the history of where this soul comes from. Now, and we said that that's why, in particular in Jewish people, there is the natural tendency to have compassion, to help others, to be kind, which is generally speaking, by majority, of the Jewish nation, this comes natural. Do you have people from other nations that could also be nice and kind and so on and so forth? The answer is of course. And anyone from the nations, the other nations of the world that practice that level of kindness and doing good for others actually have a title in Hebrew. They're called Chasidei Umus Olam, the Hasidim, the kind people of the nations of the world. But there is a difference here, and the difference is that in the level of kindness that a person could practice, there could be many various levels. There are people that do acts of kindness. Why? Because somebody forced them to, right? You're walking with a friend and see a poor person. The friend says, "No, hey, Jack, what's the story? You're not going to give $1 to the guy?" It makes you uncomfortable, and then you give charity. There are some people that are walking down the street and they see a poor person, and the person keeps on sticking their hand in their face. They kind of feel embarrassed. What I'm going to do is say, no, okay, here is $1. There are some other people that walk down the street, see a poor person, and they give $1. Why? Because you know what? I feel bad. I just ate a big sandwich and now I feel uncomfortable because this guy doesn't have anything to eat. So in order to clear my conscience, I'm gonna give $1 now. Okay. Then there is other people that will give it because hey, I'm thankful to God for everything I have had, happiness and joy. So it's only right that if I want to show my appreciation to God, I'm going to give $1. Then there is yet another level of people that will be walking down the street and will give $1 to the poor person. Why? Because it's the right thing to do. The person needs it. Forget about me. What I ate, I didn't eat. Do I have? Do I not have? Or if I feel good. Some people give charity because they feel good, right? There's some people that give charity, for example, and they say, hey, I don't want you to mention my name anywhere, and this is it. And there are some people that will give the charity and they say, hey, I want to make sure you get the name right and you have it in big letters on top of the building. So there's all different ways that people give charity and all different kinds of personal reasons. Everyone could be kind, but the underlying reason of why they're being kind, there's many different levels. And that lofty level to give to somebody else, to do kindness, not because it makes you feel good, not because otherwise you feel uncomfortable, not because your friend forced you to, you do it just because it's the right thing that needs to be done. That the whole world is not necessarily on that level. So Jewish people, by virtue of what they have inherited from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, in their soul, this is deep rooted that we have a responsibility to the world, and this is the right thing to do. We're going to do it out of justice. We're going to help somebody else, which is, by the way, the reason why in Hebrew, giving charity is called tzedakah, right? Tzedakah is the Hebrew word for charity, which doesn't literally mean charity. It's the wrong translation for it. Tzedakah in Hebrew means justice. When you help somebody else, whether it's financial or in any other shape or form, we say, that was a big tzedakah you gave that person. Why? Because that was big justice. In other words, you're serving justice. You did it because that's the right thing to do. So that is something that inheritingly Jewish people have inherited this from our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's now implanted in our soul to do that, to go after justice and save people, help people, no matter what. However, other people, other nations of the world, they don't necessarily, there are many people, many wonderful, amazing people amongst them that will go to the end of the world to save lives and do and so on and so forth. But that's not necessarily their level by majority. Not all of them will serve justice because of the virtue of justice, because that's the right thing to be done. So this is something, again, special, one of the good character traits that comes out of this first soul that is in every single person. Now, in the next chapter, we're going to be introduced to the second soul, and we're going to be spending the next couple of chapters learning about both of these souls in a person interacting at the same time. And we're going to be introduced to the second soul, which is the godly soul. And the reason why we call the animalistic soul the first soul, and the other soul the second one, is because the animalistic soul that we learned about this week is what gets activated in a person first. Even though a person is born with both souls, the power of the first soul is what gets released into the body as soon as that child is alive, and it takes over, and it gives it the instincts that it needs, the natural instincts for it to be able to live. In other words, where does it come from? When a child is born and right away the child has a sense of breathing, of wanting to eat, which is all miraculous, of course, but those are what this animalistic soul, which has a purpose of putting life force into the body, accomplishes, that gives it the sense of wanting to survive physically and to enjoy things. You know, a baby, as soon as a baby is born, a baby loves a cuddle, loves to be wrapped up and kept secure. All those senses and everything else, which gives the child a pleasure, it all comes from this first soul that gives it the life force. The second soul, we're going to learn next week, gets its power, it gets released into the person at different stages in life. The first stage is when that child is 8 days old. But we're going to leave all those exciting stuff for next week. So again, we have now a synopsis of being introduced to the fact that a person has two souls, as explained in the books of Kabbalah and mysticism. These two souls are different. The first one we have been introduced to. We understand that this first soul has unique characteristics and it has unique benefits to a person. It could be the source of good things in a person as well, but it all depends of how a person develops and a person interacts with this soul. Any questions that I could answer? Yes, Beth.
Did you mention another soul that was just completely evil? You said 3 levels of evil or something. I didn't. It was quick, and I didn't quite get it.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. So I didn't say there was another soul. I mentioned that there is another level of impurity, right? So I mentioned how there is 2 different levels of impurity in the world. The level that is completely impure and the level that has some potential of good in it, even though it's impure, but it's mixed with good. And what we learned is that this first soul that we're talking about in us comes from that level, the level that is impurity and goodness mixed together. And that's why it has a potential and we could work with it.
Okay.
Yes. Mr. Parhami, you had a question?
Yes, I actually have 2 questions. But this is what you just taught us is very, very complicated. So I thought that molecular cellular biology was complicated, but I guess now I am seeing that there's more complicated stuff. and this has to percolate. So I am
Sure.
sorry if my question doesn't really come across
No,
as
that's
clear
fine. That's perfectly
as it
fine.
should.
Listen, these are heavy subjects, and that's why it's good.
But
It's like you need a good cup of tea and a chocolate bar after you learn these
right.
things, just to let everything sink in, you know?
So my first question is, if Adam and Eve were all spiritual in the beginning, and God really didn't want them to eat from the tree of knowledge, there must have been a reason why God created the tree of knowledge and put it in front of them.
Yes, very, very good. That is a heavy question in mystical writings because, hey, what's the story? God can't control his own creation.
Right.
He couldn't put a, it's dial 1-800, get a fence, and he could have put up a good fence around the tree, right? He could have done many things. So what's the story? That here suddenly Adam and Eve and go ahead and do this wrong thing. So again, for the sake of trying to simplify things, we don't want to take a whole hour to dig into this, but in mysticism, it explains that yes, even though God told them not to eat from it, God's plan really was that things should happen exactly the way it happened. In other words, mysticism explains that everything that came about after the eating of the tree of knowledge, which was that the physical world suddenly got sunk into a low level where suddenly the world wasn't functioning the way originally it was meant to be, right? As the Torah says, that suddenly from that point on, human beings had to work hard, and the earth wouldn't just give produce on its own. And suddenly, simple things like childbirth became a process and became something painful. It wasn't meant to be that way. Physical aspects of life were meant to be just very easy and simple so that Adam and Eve, and thereby humanity, could just concentrate on the lofty and spiritual matters in the world. But as an aftermath of the tree of knowledge, suddenly the whole world changed. That change, that sinking low of the world, and the end result, where God said it's going to now become the job of Adam and Eve and their children to go into the world and reverse what has happened, even though it may take generations, that they're going to need to bring spirituality into the world. They're going to have to go and seek the light within the darkness in the world and not give up and find that light, bring it out, go against the darkness and make the world a better place. That entire process was exactly what God wanted. God wanted it to be a world that is going to have challenges and is going to be humanity that is going to interact with those challenges and bring the world back to a high spiritual level. So everything that happened was actually exactly part of the master plan. Of course, we could go in a circle and then say, if that's the case, then why did Adam and Eve get punished, right? it's but it's again, it's a whole lecture by itself. We could dedicate a couple of hours just to because again, it's a well known and a heavy question in mysticism exactly about all of this. So it was great, good thinking, critical thinking, and you were onto something. Yes. Yeah. So in a way, what we could say, according to Kabbalah and mysticism, the world as we have it now, after the sin of tree of knowledge, is is really the ultimate purpose that why God created the world. So God created the world originally to be more spiritual. physical world, but physicality wasn't the focus. Spirituality was the focus. But that was only the initial setup of the world so that the world could fall. But being that the world was already initially at a high place, it has its path to go back to there. So in other words, we're not trying to create a world that never existed. All we're trying to do since then, all the generations, is to lift the world back up to the level that it was.
But what's the purpose of spirituality then? I mean, why would God want to create a world that was just for spirituality if there was no sense or purpose of this physicality?
So no, that's exactly that. So that's what we're saying, that God created the physicality with this purpose in mind, that the world will sink low, and then it will be exactly that the physical world will be the ultimate place where humanity will have a role. Why? Because as far as spiritual realms, God had already created the angels. God had already created all the spiritual realms. There was no there was no need for him to create yet another realm,
Mhm.
and to have a realm spiritual with people or with creatures that don't do anything wrong. Those were the angels. God already had it. There was no, you want to get a little bit light about it. There was no fun in it. That was, where's the fun? It's all accomplished already. So God in particular wanted a world that could have variation. It could sink, and that the people will actually be players in the game, that they will become kind of partners with God in in keeping the balance of this world. So God infused this creation with both. He had spirituality and anything that was physical and even against spirituality. And once this was all introduced to the world, basically God said, okay, children, all the game pieces are in place. Now let's go at it. And those challenges, heading off those challenges, overcoming them, and coming out of those challenges from darkness to light is exactly what gives God the ultimate pleasure. So that's, why did he want the world to be set up this way? We're not God. We don't, obviously, God could have created many different types, but that is the purpose. That's why he created physicality, so that this goal could be accomplished in it. Because otherwise, just spirituality without physical, without challenges, okay, that's the realm of the angels, of the higher spiritual realms. No need for that.
Thank you.
Or did you have one more question?
If no, maybe other people have questions. I don't want to take all the time.
No, no problem.
Um,
Okay, because you mentioned two questions. So
yes. So the other question is, you know, so we are given life, and I assume that we have to cherish that life that we're given. If there was no pleasures, physical pleasures, then why would we cherish that life? Because that life is giving us the ability to really enjoy the pleasures, enjoy being with our parents, with our children, the enjoyment of eating an orange.
sure.
All of these enjoyments
Right. No, so
brings us to the
obviously,
point.
no, let's clarify here that
Yes.
what we're explaining here is not, God forbid, that the Torah or Judaism is against pleasure. Of course not.
No,
I
no.
mean, look, so many aspects of our Torah is all about the pleasure. It comes the day of Shabbat. We say you gotta eat, you gotta drink, you gotta be able to
Right.
sleep, and you gotta build the sukkah, it's all the fun stuff. It's
Right.
not the pleasure, but rather the fact that the Torah uh, gives us instructions of what kind of pleasure. In other words, as human beings, we could delve into pleasures that are kosher or not kosher. And I don't just mean food, So uh, take intimacy. A person could be intimate with anyone or could be intimate with his or her spouse. Okay. One is a mitzvah, and that kind of pleasure is what actually is considered to be the utmost spirituality that two people could experience together. The other one would be a sin according to Torah. So pleasure, let's say eating an orange, absolutely. As a matter of fact, the Torah tells us to make a blessing for eating orange, right? And afterwards, why? To thank Hashem for the pleasure and the use that we're getting. But at the same time, God says, but as far as that ham, don't put that in your mouth. Or those, sea creatures, what are they called? The crabs and lobsters and things of that sort. Do they give pleasure? Of course they give people pleasure. But that pleasure is not approved. So it is that challenge and the freedom of choice that is given to a person. And when God sees that the person is really challenged, is tempted, hey, listen, I just passed by that restaurant next door, and I could see that they're barbecuing a nice big quarter-pound burger with a pack of cheese on top of it, and it's mouth-watering. But I will still hold myself back and say, no, I'll wait. I'll go home and I'll make my own kosher burger. I'm not going to have this. So holding off from the forbidden pleasure, and at the same time, though, go ahead for the permissible pleasure, that freedom of choice. And when the person exercises it, that is what God wanted. The spiritual uplifting of the world happens through that, which, by the way, is one of the main differences between, let's say, Judaism and other belief systems, or whatever you want to call in the world, right? So they believe that the more spiritual a person is, or the more godly you want to be, the more out of touch with the world you have to be. So if you want to be spiritual, don't get married. You can't have children. You want to be spiritual, you got to go lock yourself up on top of a mountain or in a building and don't come out of it for years. And this is how you become spiritual. Judaism is the exact opposite. It says you want to be spiritual, got to get married, have a lot of kids, have a wonderful marriage, and enjoy everything in marriage, and have a house, and have a beautiful house, and make lots of money. That's very Jewish. You got to make lots of money. Why? Because you want to live a physical life according to the Torah, and that takes money. So Judaism says, and you can't go live in Timbuktu. You got to live in a community where you could come and you could go and interact. And all of that makes you spiritual, not to stay away from the world. Judaism says that godliness is found in the physical life and in physicality. And that's why most of the commandments of the Torah, out of 613 commandments, most of the commandments are physical commandments. Very few of them are spiritual. In other words, yeah, we have a mitzvah that says, love your God. That's not a physical commandment. It's telling you to love God. But the rest, most of it is all physical commandments. How to interact with life, because that's how you elevate the sparks of holiness that are in all physical aspects of life. So pleasure is a good thing according to Judaism, but it just has to be the type of pleasure that is according to Torah, and so to say, the kosher way. Okay?
Thank you.
Sure. All right. Any other questions? Yes? Larry, did you have a question?
Uh, I just want to ask you about being like meat, kosher meat.
Sure.
So even if you go to McDonald's and you order a hamburger without the cheese, that's not necessarily kosher still, right? The meat has to be.
No, yeah, a kosher meat means a meat that comes from a kosher animal, which means, what is a kosher animal? That first of all, it has the kosher signs, which means it has the potential that if you take that meat, that animal, and slaughter it the kosher way, and then process the meat, take out, soak it with salt, and take all the blood out, and wash it, and rinse it, and all of that.
Yeah.
Then you cook it in a kosher pot with kosher ingredients, right? And all of that is done according to the rules. Now, this is kosher food. This is kosher meat.
Okay.
So even though the beef of the sandwich in a regular restaurant out there is from a cow, and cow is potentially a kosher animal, but practically they didn't follow. They didn't slaughter the meat. They didn't drain all the blood. They didn't rinse it. They didn't cook it in a kosher pot and a kosher oven with kosher ingredients. So there's a lot of steps that all have to be in place for the food to be considered kosher.
Okay. Does the same thing apply with chicken and turkey and fish?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Okay. All right, everyone. Have a wonderful evening and a Shabbat Shalom. We're going to see you guys on Sunday for those that want to log in for the Kabbalah class. We're going to be continuing the subject matter that we started last week. All right.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.